This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes per detail.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions, and the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Dan Mirvish. Dan is a screenwriter and film director and a producer, and his new film, 18 and a Half, is available now on demand, streaming at any good streaming service. And if you're in the States, there are some theatres which will be showing it, so please try to hunt them out. This is the kind of film that, you know how everybody says, oh, the cinema of the 70s, I wish they were making that sort of film. Well, this is that sort of film. It's a brilliant political sort of thriller, comedy, oddball in a sort of Hal Ashby kind of way. It's really good, well worth a watch. So I hope this conversation will lead you to have a look at it if you haven't already. Remember, if you enjoy the episode, to like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter if you like, at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. I've not got a blue tick, I'm afraid, but you know, who really cares? That sort of stuff. We are shining things. We don't care about this, you know, piffle. So anyway, did I say I didn't care about it? I think I did. I think I said it once or twice. So one thing I also ought to mention is Lee Singer, a good friend of mine and friend of the podcast. He pointed out at the very beginning of the podcast, where the introduction, the musical introduction, and where I talk, I say on cinema like that in an upward intonation, which he finds incredibly funny. So I'm very tempted to re-record that to take away even an iota of pleasure that he seems to be getting because of my hubris. So we'll see how that goes. Anyway, before you need to concern yourself with any of those matters, please enjoy the conversation. Just so I don't forget. Yeah. Is Omaha like would be considered Midwest sort of?
Yeah, it's literally the middle of the country. Yeah.
Right, definitely. Right. So it's got. I always get I'm not sure if it's a correct comparison, but I always think of the Russian steppes, like the Midwest, just in the sense that you're in the middle of a massive landmass, and so you know there's no seas or oceans around you.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and no mountains either. So yeah, there was no fun to be had anywhere.
And you grew up there in Omaha?
Yeah. I got out when I can.
Was it like a town or a village or a...
No. It's got about 500,000 people, so it's sort of a big enough of a city that it's got a little bit of everything, good and bad and otherwise. But it's just very isolated. There's no other cities near it. So, the closest big city is Kansas City, and that's 4 hours away. So
wow,
you just feel really isolated out there. Yeah.
So you basically have to fly if you want to get anywhere sort of remotely interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, for driving hours. You can, it's 8 hours to the mountains or most other cities. So yeah.
Well, what was it like culturally? What was was it okay from that point of view?
Yeah, because as I say, it was sort of big, just barely big enough to have an opera and symphony and art museum and different religions and immigrants and so it sort of had the trappings of a big city, but just barely. So not, and had theater. It's always been a good theater town. So a lot of actors, Henry Fonda came from there, and Marlon Brando, and, a lot of people came from there, and then never went back. But so it sort of had everything you would want in a city. And growing up, I would go there. It didn't really have an art house per se when I was growing up, but there would be art house films at the local college. They would have a screening series, so I'd go see things there. And now there's a pretty good actually one of the better sort of theatrical art houses in the country is in Omaha and has 3 screens, and so I just came back from there. We were screening the film 2 weeks there, which was a lot of fun. So,
excellent.
But my mom still lives there, and so I go back quite a bit.
Oh, good. So you haven't sort of like brushed the dust off your shoes and
No, and a lot of my backers on 18 and a half are still from there, because a lot of old friends from high school, and one of my producing partners is Dana Altman, who's Robert Altman's grandson. He still lives in Omaha. So, and he's based there. So he helps me raise money, and we work, together on a lot of things. So, so there's professional reasons I go back there, but also, friends and family. So
yeah, it's interesting, those places that are sort of small and I mean, as you say, 500,000 people's not small by any stretch of the imagination, but they're kind of contained. Let's say that maybe that's a better way of thinking about it. Yeah, because there can be a tendency for a place like that to generate an ecosystem where you have to create your own entertainment because nobody's necessarily coming through.
Exactly.
Was that the case in Omaha?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it was certainly, the first film I did, which was called Omaha the Movie, you see the poster there. I mean, that was a case where I had left Omaha. I was going to film school at USC, but then I'd written the script that was set back in Nebraska, and I went back there. And this was before Alexander Payne was making his film. So I was the first real local indie film made there. And it was great because we got, the local film commission. They're the ones who introduced me to Dana. They got me a meeting with the mayor. The mayor was like, sure, we'll give you anything you want, cranes, an office, anything. And then the mayor wanted to be in the movie, so we had a part for the mayor in the movie. And then the governor's office called, and they were like, well, we heard the mayor wants to be in the movie. Now is there a part for the governor? And I was like, well, there is now, and the governor gets in. And that was great because then the head of the roads department worked for the governor. So then that gave us access to any highway in the entire state, so it was, and then even on 18 and a half, we had Omaha Steaks, which is the big local company that makes steaks. They're still a product placement sponsor of the movie.
Right.
Largely because I grew up with a guy who owns a company, so I've known him for 50 years. So yeah, you get that support. there, and like I say, there's like a pretty active theater scene, so there's a lot of interesting theater coming out of there, and yeah, so it's but yeah, exactly, because you're not relying on anything or anyone else, so you just jumpstart everything, yourself, whether it's a zine or a play or a movie or whatever it is.
Yeah, in my small town, it was bands. Everybody
Yep.
bought an instrument, and it's also because where I lived it was basically a peninsula. It's just like somebody called it a 40-mile cul-de-sac. That you just drove out, and then the sea started. So nobody was ever passing through. There was nowhere else to go.
Right.
So, but there was a big submarine factory. There was a big sort of shipyard. And so we had like 100% employment. So people would leave school at 16, go straight into employment, and by the time they were in their early 20s, they were earning, pretty good wages. And but there was nothing to do. So basically, if you weren't into football or sport or anything like that, then you bought a drum kit, or you bought a bass guitar, or you bought and so we had thriving. Absolutely, I'm sure maybe I'm rose tinting it. But I just remember it being so creative, and for instance, no one did covers. It was all original material.
Wow.
It was
wow, that's great.
What the heck?
Yeah.
But let's talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk. Sorry, you just broke up a tiny bit. Then I'm not sure if it
Oh,
was...
sorry.
No, it's okay. I just
Nothing important.
Okay. I'm sure it'll come out. And maybe sometimes when I play it back, the bits that sounded odd are magically smoothed out. I don't know how.
Yeah.
No, I wanted to talk about 18 and a Half, which is your latest film, and which is I think it's on video on demand in the UK, in the States as well. Is it still in theatrical?
Yeah. In the US, on video in US, Canada, UK, and Ireland right now. And it's still playing. We're sort of on the tail end of a 60-city theatrical run in the US as well. So it's still playing a few places in theaters here too.
I really love this film, and I'm really sorry that you sent me a link to it like 100 years ago, and I was like, I'll get round to it. And then I saw it on an on-demand service, and I thought, okay, right, now I've got to. Now that it's out in the world, I've got to see it. First of all, the title, you've got that. I know obviously it has a very specific plot point in the movie, but it's also that Fellini reference.
Yeah, although it wasn't for me. That was obviously about Fellini, and Fellini was friends with Jules Pfeiffer, who wrote my last film, who wrote Bernard and Huey. So he had some good Fellini stories. But Fellini was no idiot. Like eight and a half starts with a number, which means alphabetically it's always going to be first in any listing. And I thought, well, yeah, he was pretty smart about that. So, but there's not really any direct linkage, except they both films kind of take place at a seaside motel, and that's about the beginning and the end of it. And some of our characters are a little wacky, I suppose. But
oh yeah, I felt a little bit of a tinge, let's say a tinge.
Yeah,
It's definitely not a direct. There's no huge quotes or anything like that. So
no, and it kind of betrays more my roots in politics, because I worked in DC for a couple of years as a Senate speechwriter, and someone says the word 18 and a half, and immediately you think Watergate. You don't think Fellini. So, for me, that was always kind of first and foremost in my mind. But anyway.
Right. So when did that fit in your career in Washington? So you left the University of Southern California, where you were doing your...
No, so I did my undergraduate degree in St. Louis, which was an 8-hour drive from Omaha. And that was kind of when I first started to get involved with film. There was but they didn't have a film program. They had one Super 8 class. So I took that, liked it, did some summer classes at UCLA where I learned 16 millimeter, went back to school. But I wound up majoring in history and and I did a semester in DC internship. And then when I graduated, I thought I might go to film school. So I took the GREs, which is the test to get into any graduate school. But then I went to DC, worked a little bit as a journalist first, and then got this job as a speechwriter for about a year and a half. But even doing that, we recorded, this senator I worked for, we recorded a lot of his speeches in the basement of the Capitol. There's a couple of video studios. We would do a lot on video, and then just send the VHS out to, the Boy Scout troop in Point or wherever it was. So I was still hanging out with cameras and editing equipment, even though I wasn't really doing much myself, because there were these guys in the booth and they kept saying, yeah, you ought to go to film school, kid. And so after a couple of years, I thought, I like DC. It went really well for me, but I thought I still wanted to try my hand at filmmaking. So then I applied to film school, got into USC. That was the only one I got into. And then got my master's degree in graduate production, in filmmaking there. And then my thesis film, that's when I did Omaha the movie. And then I kind of never look back. I've been in LA ever since. So but I've still had that political side in me. So I've always been curious about Watergate and interested in Watergate, and also not just Watergate specifically, but just kind of the culture of 20 somethings in Washington having access to amazing information and power, and how do you use that responsibly, and that kind of, you see it obviously in the film with Connie, the Willa Fitzgerald character, but it also kind of relates to, what we just saw in the States with the January 6 hearings. You had, 25-year-old Cassidy Hutchinson, dropping these bombshells on the presidency, because people forget 25-year-olds in the White House know a lot and they see a lot, and, and then, wrestling with, do you leak it? Do you release it? Do you testify about it or not?
Yeah, and they've also sort of got less to lose they haven't started their careers yet, so they could always go to California, for instance, and do something else.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly.
And they might even be more sort of ideologically, I'm not sure about. There's a little bit of me that doesn't want to wave any sort of cheerleading pom-poms for people, leaving the sinking ship. But you seem to be pretty happy for 4 years while Trump was in power.
Yeah, and we do go into that a little bit with Connie's character, like when John Magaro says, well, I'll bet you voted for Nixon twice, and yeah, that is always the interesting thing with people that are seeking the best material, is they were at one point true believers, or they wouldn't have been there in the first place. And so that's always kind of the interesting thing that they wrestle with, and then how the rest of us have to perceive whatever it is they're leaking, and is it colored by their own experience.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point, that you need the Judas Iscariot has to be an amazing Christian to begin with. Has to be one of the disciples. He can't be just some geezer, turning up from outside.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's also the interesting comparison between the Nixon scandal and Watergate and what just happened in the UK with with Boris Johnson, is that some of the more interesting scandals come not necessarily from the principal person, but from all the crazy loyalists around them, and all the hand wringing and cover-ups that they do out of blind loyalty. And but then what is the person in the middle of it? Are they encouraging that or not? So
I think
that would certainly be with Watergate.
Yeah, I think in both cases it's that they're spreading a culture of that sort of stuff. So it's almost like the thing with Trump of sort of like someone whose whole philosophy is never apologize, never admit weakness. That just spreads to everybody. It's this is what the boss would do.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, that's what. I remember, because when I was living in Italy when Berlusconi was around, and Berlusconi, I think, was very much a precursor to all these political woes that we've got at the moment.
Yeah.
I remember somebody on the Italian news saying this would never happen in America, because in America you had Nixon, and Nixon had to resign for just lying. And it was always held up as this, look how that system works, because they got rid of a president just for lying, you know. And compared to Berlusconi, who's been found guilty of so many other things, and he's still there. That was the sort of comparison. And now it's just like, wow, that the time of Nixon feels innocent now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that, you know, and at the end of the day, I mean, I wanted to make a film that would, you know, sort of reflect on everything that was going on with Nixon. But I think part of it was, it wasn't just that he lied once and then he, you know, he was forced out of office. Is people forget there were a lot of other scandals going on. The ITT scandal, which most people completely forget, was front page news up until Watergate became front page news, and then it went on the back page. But there were tons of other scandals. We don't even get into all of them in the movie. And I think, and it was interesting talking to Pfeiffer about this, because he did these political cartoons about Nixon in the 70s. And, you know, he said, yeah, Watergate was just like the tip of the iceberg. People had been frustrated with Nixon, you know, for decades, even before he was president. Half the people in the country thought he was a weasel. And it was really only with Watergate and specifically with the 18.5-minute gap that I think his own party finally turned on him, and that was the nail in the coffin for him.
I mean, do you think that that idea that their party, I mean, that's another parallel which doesn't seem to work anymore, is that we're in a situation in which the party, the GOP, is not going to turn on Trump, like, ever, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and people kept waiting for that to happen, and it never happened, and it still hasn't happened, because again, with Nixon, like, it did finally happen, but it never did with Trump and the GOP now, and yeah, that's a big difference for sure.
What about the role of the journalists in this sort of situation as well? Because I love when your character says, you know, he's basically competing with the Washington Post. It's like, the Washington Post are kicking our ass, so we really need a thing. So like, even within the sort of, it's not, you know, Woodward and Bernstein sort of the sword of truth and the shield of authenticity. Yeah. It's like, no, we need circulation as well. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and even back in their time, it you know, there was competition. You know, CBS News was there, and the New York Times. There were, you know, the Spielberg movie, The Post, you know, got into a lot of that competition between the New York Times and the Washington Post. But yeah, that was definitely there, you know, at the time, and you see it now even more, where, you know, where each cable station is trying to, you know, outthink each other and get the scoops and get the exclusives, and you know, and what I've found interesting just over the years with other projects I've done is that, you know, then as someone who is leaking material or revealing material or trying to get a story out, you can use that competition to your advantage. You can play them all off against each other. And there's always a little bit of that dynamic at play here, as you know, as his motivation. One of the things that, I mean, especially because as a Writers on Film podcast, I'm interested in the writing of the screenplay. And the thing. One thing I'd really have to congratulate you on is the MacGuffin that you have is just so clever. It's so rich, that idea. Where did that, I mean, where did that sort of come from? Because of course it's the missing minutes of the tape. Yeah. But just the idea that they would accidentally record themselves trying to delete it was just genius. I mean, it goes beyond MacGuffin. It becomes, you know,
it's much more. So, well, first of all, just kind of stepping back. I mean, the idea for this thing happened when it was on the last day of shooting my last film, Bernard and Huey. coincided with the presidential election in 2016. Trump had just been elected. I then went out to see, to show dailies of that film to Pfeiffer, who was living in Shelter Island, which is the tip of Long Island. And inevitably, we started making these comparisons and chatting about Nixon and Trump. And then that night, I took the ferry over to Greenport, Long Island, a small town on the northern tip of Long Island, where my friend Terry owns this motel, the Silver Sands Motel. And he inherited it from his grandparents in the 50s and 60s, but he's kind of maintained this vintage look. They've done a lot of fashion shoots and music videos, but no one's ever shot a feature. He says, well, if you come up with the story, everyone on the cast and crew can stay out here. And he was with me talking to Pfeiffer, so we both kind of had Watergate on the first and foremost on the mind. I was like, 1974. It looks like 1974. It's a great location, but how can we make a Watergate film here when the bulk of the Watergate story happened in Washington, D.C. And then I thought about it for a while, and then I got a writing partner involved, Daniel Moya, who had been an intern on my last film. Coincidentally, his aunt and uncle owned this diner that was just down the street from the Silver Sands. So we're like, well, now that's 2 locations. Now we have to make a movie. So now I knew a fair bit about Watergate just from my own background. Daniel was much younger than me. He still is. And so he was kind of doing original research for, kind of coming at it as a fresh 25-year-old. But in doing the research, one of the most interesting things we found was that there really are tapes of Nixon listening to tapes in a room that room had its own voice activated taping system, because there really were 4 or 5 different rooms in the White House complex that had the taping systems. And there really are tapes of him kind of fumbling around with the buttons and listening to this. And once we realized that, then it was like, now there's a plausible way in that a character like Connie could have access to the 18.5-minute gap that we know in real life was deleted. And but then it also, as you say, like, it made it much more interesting, because then we didn't just have a version of the tape, we had a version of the people talking about how and where they're going to erase the tape. So all of a sudden that introduced, 2 layers that we could, make up, so it's fictional. So once we sort of had that idea for the MacGuffin, and the plausible, idea, then it gave us a way to somehow get to this motel, which we then geographically, we moved it closer to Washington. We say it's in Maryland, which is a lot closer to DC, but it's still, we still came up with that. But I think philosophically also, my approach to historical fiction is, and I don't know if it's more or less traditional than, but like, if you compare it to Tarantino, for example, where something will happen in the past and history is completely rewritten. We're on a completely different alternate timeline by the end of his movies. And what I wanted to do very specifically was create this sort of fictional, loop. It's 24 hours, really, what happens in the film. But by the end of it, without completely spoiling the end of the movie, history's completely reset itself to what we know. There is no 18.5-minute gap. It was deleted. And so I don't know if that's called speculative, plausible historical fiction or what. I'm sure there's some sort of academic description of that. But that was kind of what we were aiming for, was, so how do we create this story that somehow the ending is predetermined, is what we know it is to be. So that was always kind of the challenge, was what can we do and how do we make that work?
And it's much more fitting to the sort of the milieu of the time, really. All those paranoid, 3 Days of the Condor and the Parallax View and all that sort of, that era of paranoid thrillers that we had, which this, I think, is really, really diving into and being right in the middle of that.
Thank you. Well, that was always my original pitch to Daniel and to Terry and everyone, was, it's 3 days. I wanted to do 3 Days of the Condor meets Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but a little funnier than either of those. So
Right, there you go. There's your elevator pitch right there. Yeah, absolutely. If you hadn't already made it, I'd be writing a check right now to see that.
Well, thanks, sir. Thanks, John.
But it's it reminds me a little bit as well, that idea. I'd love this idea of sort of doing history, but a little to the left or a little to the right of not politically, but of just. Not in the center of the action is what I'm trying to say. So sort of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern version.
Exactly.
Of,
right.
Who are the attendant lords? Who's the girl, the woman who's typing stuff in the transcribing room?
Yeah. And again, that sort of goes back to my own history in Washington, where I saw like there is a vast number of people that you never hear about, that are these 25-year-olds or 20-year-olds or longtime civil servant staffers who are not, who are not political appointees. So they're there throughout different administrations. That's where there's a reference to, oh, she's a GS2, not a GS4, and because that's a level of civil servant, category. So that was always kind of one of the ideas I always wanted to play around with.
Yeah, the sort of, I mean, what we call the civil service in I think in England, we have these civil servants that who, following on from the Johnsonian scandals, they're kind of, a lot of those career civil servants have been the people who have ended up blowing the whistle, because it's just like, we're here to defend the office, we're not here to defend the individual.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you saw that in Trump's first impeachment, especially, where you had these national security and foreign service officers who were, they're essentially apolitical people, but they're the ones monitoring the calls and listening in and working in the sort of the lower level of the White House. They don't care who's president. They're like, hey, I'm work for the military or the foreign service or the national security, commission. It doesn't matter to me, if he's gonna try to bribe the president of Ukraine, I'm gonna blow the whistle on it.
Yeah. The political leaders are just like the weather; they're just coming in and then going out again, and you have to make sure the ship's more or less in the same state as they left it.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you find when you were writing the story, then you had your setting already sorted because you had your locations, you had your time period because you wanted it to be sort of a unit of time. How did you go about sort of getting the story and the characters there to sort of fit those parameters that you'd set yourself?
Well, we did, and this was at a time when I was traipsing around the world going to film festivals with Bernard and Huey. So I knew I was going to be busy with that. So that's why I really wanted to get Daniel involved, and kind of we came up with the story together, talking it through. And then I kind of set him loose to write the first few drafts of the script. I think initially we wanted to keep it even simpler, and it was just basically these two couples, Connie and Paul, and then they meet this older couple, played by Vondie Curtis Hall and Kathy Curtin, Lena and Samuel, who were sort of this representative of the World War II generation. And we actually had a few drafts with just them, and the hotel was more sparse. And then we just sort of shared the script with a few friends, and they're like, yeah, you need a couple more people here. The locations are, locations can be either the cheapest or the most expensive thing in your budget, but actually adding a few extra characters doesn't cost you that much more money. So we're like, okay. So then we came up with the hippie characters, and that made, and we already had the Richard Kind character who plays like the guy who runs a hotel. So then it was about adding them in there as well, and just kind of populating the world, even though it's supposed to be kind of winter and sparse and not a lot of people. But we were like, yeah, okay, let's just add those characters in. Yeah, so that was one big sort of change we made kind of in midstream, was adding those. And then the other interesting thing I think that happened just from a writing perspective is, when I sort of first turned Daniel loose on the screenplay, he kind of added, the first 30 pages of the first draft were all sort of this introduction where Connie goes to work and we meet people that she works with, and how does she get the tape, and how does she decide to leak it to this reporter and make the call and things like that. And then she only gets on the ferry on page 31,
Right.
and shows up in the town. And I said, well, that's great, but I want to start the movie, on page 31. And so let's cut out everything from before that. And at first he was like, what? I just spent, a month working on that. I said, it's okay. It will come in handy, for us, for the characters, for, us knowing that backstory is important to us writing the rest of the script. We don't have to show it. And in the end, we show a little tiny couple snippets of it as flashback, and that's fine too. But without having to go into, all the details. And so that was an interesting kind of pivot in the writing process. And so that's just one little insight into sort of how we did that.
When you got the casting sort of locked, was that a point at which the screenplay was locked as well, or did you find yourself going, oh well, I think we know who's going to play this character, so I can write a bit more in this direction, or how did that work out?
So the casting was, for the most part, pretty last minute, and I can get into that later. So we had the script done quite a bit earlier. The one actor that we kind of wrote with them in mind, or with their voice in mind, was Richard Kind.
That's exactly who I was thinking of, because he's just so good. He's so good. I think the only thing you'd have to do is try to stop yourself from writing more and more stuff for him, because he's just such a
we
great
did. Yeah, exactly. So Rich had been in my last film. He had been in Bernard and Huey. So I knew him. I was familiar with him. We'd done rehearsals on that film, so I kind of knew what his range was. And Daniel had worked on that film too, so he was familiar with him too. Now, but we also knew that he's always very busy. And, because he'll do anything. Like, he'll show up for food. As long as you feed him, he'll be there. Whether it's a play, a podcast, a TV show, a feature film, Pixar movie, voiceover, he'll show up. So I knew that we had access to him. Like, I could call him. I knew his agent. I knew his manager. But I didn't know for sure we'd get him, because it was always very schedule dependent. But just as a sort of a voice that Daniel and I had in our head for that character, we're like, all right, let's sort of imagine Rich's voice in it. And even if it's a different actor, it'll still, be kind of that unique voice. And then we got lucky in the end, and we were able to get, scheduled. That was good. But otherwise, we, as a filmmaker, I always try to keep a very open mind about who the cast is going to be. I try not to have any preconceived ideas at all, because number one, you're never going to get the person that you think you're going to get. I mean, the Richard Kind being the one exception. But for the, you could say, oh, I'm best friends with Tom Cruise. I've known him for 30 years, and then I'm going to write a part just for him. And then, you get ready to shoot, and he's shooting, Maverick or, Top Gun or something. It's like, whoops, I guess I don't have that guy. So you can never know for sure who you're going to get on these kind of films, even if you want. But also, that if you have someone kind of preconceived in your head, it does a bit of a disservice to the actor that you do wind up getting, because they get a sense that, hang on a second, I wasn't the first choice, and I know specifically who your first choice was, and I'm never going to match up or be exactly the same as that person. So I very sort of consciously try to keep an open mind about casting when we're in the writing process. So in our case, we finished the script more or less in May of 2019. Willa Fitzgerald was the first person we met with for Connie. She was recommended by an agent that had recommended people on my last film. Also was recommended by filmmaker Lucky McKee, who I knew, and she was great. We didn't know for sure we would cast her. But she was the first meeting we had. And then we thought about other people. And then about a week or two before shooting, we went back to Willa and asked her if she was available, and she was, and still excited to be in the movie. She was great. John Magaro was recommended by Kelly Reichardt, because he just done First Cow with her, and I know her a little bit. And so she says someone's good, you trust her. But we were shooting with those two for the first. So we started shooting March 3rd, 2020. What could possibly go wrong in March of 2020?
I'm thinking back. I don't think nothing really happened much.
Yeah,
really.
nothing. No, not memorable at all. So it was sort of the early rumblings of the pandemic, but it was still already getting a little hard to get people to commit to fly from LA to New York. We had an actress that was going to play Lena that had been attached for a while. Then at the last second, her schedule didn't work out. So we were shooting for a week with just Connie and Paul, all their scenes together. And we didn't know who was going to play any of the rest of the cast. Or certainly not Lena and Samuel, the two other pivotal actors in the movie. Sure. And then with about 36 hours notice, we got Vondie Curtis Hall and Kathy Curtin attached before their scenes started. And so, Lena's, the character of Lena was always was written as a French woman. And we actually originally had a French actress that was going to play her. And the first thing Kathy says is, "Oh, I'd love to do this film. You guys are in a pickle. I'm going to come help you out. But by the way, I can't really do a French accent very well." And we're like, okay, well, let's make it a bit more of a pan-European character with her backstory. Right. We dropped in a couple little hints about that, but it was fun. And but she had such tremendous chemistry with Vondie Curtis Hall as just as actors and as characters, and that was great. But also their choices that they made were very different and unique, and a surprise to Willa and John. And so a lot of Paul and Connie's reactions in the film to this strange, crazy couple are their real reactions, because it was the first time doing it. And I've talked to Vondie about it, and he said, that was a lot of fun. On the one hand, sometimes you like to do a lot of rehearsal, but if you don't, you can make it work to your advantage. He said, it was a lot of fun knowing that these other actors had no idea what they were going to do.
It kind of becomes a game, like we're going to juice them a little bit.
Yeah, it really was like that. And especially he said, like in the dancing scene, like John Magaro had no idea what Vondie was going to do. And you really see some real reactions there, which was great. They all had fun with that. We all did. So
yeah, and the accent as well. I kind of felt that I was listening to it and trying to place her, and then sort of thinking, oh, but this really fits in with the fact that you don't quite trust anybody. So everybody,
exactly.
Anybody can be playing any kind of role at this point.
Yeah, and with those characters especially, and I had discussions with Kathy and Vondie about where was their story true and where was it false, and I think we all agreed that their sort of the backstory about him being a World War II veteran, meeting this French woman, that part was true to them as characters. Everything else was made up, but for reasons that people will find out in the movie, but that we wanted to sort of tell this real, love story, but also,
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Express what was the World War II generation doing in 1974, and what was their influences and backstories and motivations, and because normally you think of 1974, you're just telling a 70s story. Well, but there were still people around, not that much older, from who had gone through World War II. And it was interesting, kind of more on the festival circuit now, once we'd finished the film, thinking about the war in Ukraine, not to bring it too down, but thinking about like how displaced people in Europe suddenly get when there's a war. And it kind of made that character's accent make a bit more sense. Like, oh yeah, there probably were people from Alsace-Lorraine who had moved to France at the beginning of the war, or, you know, or moved to Paris. And it was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes a bit more sense, you know, contextually now. But
yeah, absolutely. The sort of melting pot has been stirred once more, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's so many other levels working here as well, because we talked already about sort of 3 Days of the Condor and that sort of stuff, but there's also sort of like a sort of sex comedy that you would sort of, you know, I'm trying to think of what's that name of that film, which is just a list of names. Bob, Carol.
Oh, Bob, Ted, Alice. And yeah, that one. Yeah,
I always get it mixed up. There's a British film called Rita, Sue, and Bob too, and I always
yeah, that is confusing, man. Right.
But yeah, I sort of had a feel for that. There was that sort of, you know, and again, you're talking about it generationally. You've got sort of like the older characters of Second World War generation going on. You've got the characters who Connie and John in the middle, who were sort of like, they're kind of like living in the 70s, but they've very consistently brought, you know, conforming to the Second World War generation, essentially, or that Eisenhower sort of background.
Right.
And then you've got the hippies sort of burning stuff on the beach and singing songs and sort of, and that's the kind of, well, I was going to say that's kind of the future, but it kind of isn't as well, because it's already the past then, isn't it? You know?
Yeah, exactly. And that was a fun thing to play around with their characters, is that the hippie you know, the peace and love hippies had already had their heyday in the 60s. So by 74, if you were still thinking of yourself as a hippie, or other people were thinking of you as a hippie, you may have just as easily been in a cult or a domestic terrorism group, or like, it was not, there was something funny about still being a hippie in 1974 that was not as simple as, you know, just peace and love 1968 Woodstock. So but also we were playing around with, in 1974 was the very tail end of the Vietnam War, and how does that affect Barry, who's the head of the hippies? You know, he's a Vietnam vet, but also, you know, it affects Connie and some of the other things going on at the time too. So yeah, so it was kind of playing with all these cultural forces, and, you know, and having fun with the specificity of 1974, as opposed to by 76 it would have been they'd be doing disco music, you know, and that kind of thing. But and that was fun to then think about and figure out what our musical choices were going to be in the film. And so I've got a great composer and dear friend, Luis Guerra, who'd worked on my last film too. And so we decided very early on to kind of lean into a Brazilian theme, which fit with the characters of Samuel and Lena, and sort of thinking about what would sort of cosmopolitan middle-aged couple in the 70s be listening to. They would be listening to sort of hip music from the 60s, which was bossa nova, and also it fit with their world travels. You know, they say they've been to Brazil, so that sort of made sense. So then we came up with fully original bossa nova song and score. I wrote the lyrics to the songs, but we had them translated by a Brazilian friend into Portuguese, and so some of them are sung in Portuguese and in English, which was done with bossa nova songs then. But then even the hippies are listening to the music they're listening to. We kind of lean into Brazilian psychedelic music called Tropicalia, and we were kind of influenced by that. And just because we wanted a sort of consistency and singers too, because we had found a great Brazilian singer in LA, Clara Pieroto, who could sing in both English and Portuguese, and could do different styles. So that sort of made sense to have her. So we had a lot of fun with the soundtrack, definitely.
And also that, I mean, that sort of stuff keeps the budget within a certain level, you know, because musical
definitely. And yeah, I mean, for sort of creative and budgetary reasons, it's I didn't want to just do, you know, put in Creedence Clearwater or the Rolling Stones, you know, that would have been a bigger budget than the whole film, you know. But also I think creatively it's a bit of a crutch that a lot of like big Hollywood period films use, because then you're listening to those lyrics, you're not listening to the dialogue. You've also got all whatever associations the audience has with those songs from either films or just the music. Whereas with original music, you can really, it's a, tabula rasa, you are putting in those first impressions of those songs.
Absolutely. And sorry, I buried my own question by asking too much in the last one, which was that sort of the sexual frisson, the sort of atmosphere, which I guess also goes with the motel. Just the fact that you've got people in a motel, so it's opportunity.
And we always wanted to have fun with that whole thing, and it's playing around with tropes that have been in plenty of other movies, with these two characters pretending to be someone they're not, and that, pretending to be a married couple, and then somehow that forces them to start kissing each other or whatever, but also playing around with the idea, is the older couple, are they swingers, are they cannibals? Like, you don't know what's going to happen. And we didn't either. So
that was such a great balancing act, because I was you want to see more of them, and then you're also saying, get out of that room.
Exactly. And that was fun, and that was a challenge also. Like, how do you put in a 24-page scene with 4 people at a dinner table and still make it feel like a movie and not a play, and so that was an interesting challenge in acting, editing, and writing, cinematography, and so we had fun with that where we could.
And I mean, it always retains a very sort of comic. There's a comic fizziness to it as it goes along, but you go to dark places.
Yeah, no, well, because at the end of the day, it's we had to sort of reset history, and this gap had to be missing, and people couldn't have too many witnesses, so
I get you. But I mean, you mentioned Tarantino. Yeah. You mentioned Tarantino earlier, and as sort of as the other way of doing it, and creating this fantasy, essentially. Charles Manson doesn't kill anybody, so I assume he's still roaming around Hollywood. I'm not. Right, maybe he goes and kills a bunch of other people a lot more efficiently.
Yeah, who knows? Right.
So, but another thing that I sort of goes with the Tarantino thing is that sort of comic use of violence. There's violence in it, but it's done with a definite sly black humor.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. But also I was very much influenced by Robert Altman, and his grandson's still one of my partners, and films like A Wedding or MASH play with you can uproarious comedy 1 minute, and then dead people the next minute, and tragedy and human drama, and so I've always been fascinated. And then Pfeiffer had written Carnal Knowledge, and that was another one that sort of plays tonally with how things go up and down. And he'd also written Little Murders that Alan Arkin directed from 1971, which is another one that sort of vastly goes from crazy, ridiculous slapstick comedy to tragedy, and in a snap of a finger. So that was something that I think 70s films did, in a way that doesn't happen as much now. But yeah, so that was, we kind of wanted to play around with those tonal changes, and they work for some people, and, hopefully for more people than don't. So yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I do think that what you're saying about Pfeiffer's earlier films and the Carnal Knowledge and Little Murders, have seen both of which, that sort of generic experimentation and sort of and tonal promiscuity, if you like, it's you're right. It's not. There should be a bit more of it, I think, because then you never quite know what you're watching. You can't get comfortable. It's a good discomfort.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that the trick, to the extent that we pulled it off, is using the music as a consistent thing, because then, and something Luis and I talked about a lot, was he said that, with bossa nova, you can kind of, while still keeping the basic rhythms and melodies, you can tweak it to be more thriller or comedic or spy or different tonal qualities, while still keeping a consistency throughout the film. So, even in the ending, where which we won't spoil, but where things take a turn for the dark side. The melodies that he's incorporating there are Brasilia Bella, which is kind of Connie's theme song that we have from the beginning, and you hear it in Portuguese during the dance scene, and you hear it in English at the very, very end of the movie. And so having that sort of these consistent melodies and rhythms with bossa nova as kind of the underlying, genre, that allows, I hope anyway, that allows us to kind of make these tonal shifts while still feeling like it's the same movie that you're watching, which was a challenge, because in editing, before we had the music in place, it's like, am I cutting the same movie here?
How long did it take you to put it together after photography finished?
Well, so I mentioned that we were shooting in March of 2020. So we, by about day 10 of shooting, and it was a 15-day schedule, the rep from the Directors Guild came out to visit us from New York, and she said, "Oh, this is great. You guys are so isolated out here," because we were 3 hours outside of New York. We were a 20-minute walk to the nearest town. And she's like, "Oh, you've got this bubble. You're all socially distant out here." And I was like, "What does that term even mean?" I'd never even heard it. And she said, "Oh, and by the way, you're one of the last 2 films shooting in North America." I was like, "What?" I was like, what does everybody else know that we don't know? Because we'd heard that, South by Southwest had been canceled, Broadway had been canceled, the NBA had been canceled, and big movies and TV shows had been canceled. We didn't realize everyone had shut down at that point. Right. So the next day, after our 11th day, we shut down as well, and we had 4 days left to go. So I grabbed a hard drive. I came back to LA. Most of the cast and crew were New York based, and actually a third of our crew, about 7 or 8 of them, wound up staying at the Silver Sands for 10 more weeks because no one else was staying there. So Terry said, "Why don't you guys just stay here? It's safer than New York at that point." And these were like the single Brooklyn types, And so they just stayed there. Our cinematographer, she stayed for 6 months. She just never left. I think she's still there for that matter. And then 6 months later, we were able, the Screen Actors Guild, Directors Guild had come up with the COVID safe protocols, but it was still very early in that process. We were one of the first films back. So we went back in September and shot the last 4 days. But then during that 6-month gap, I was editing. I was making sourdough too. That was another big project I had then, as many people.
You're the only person to have done that. That's
exactly. Well, my starter took really quickly, and I was like, all right, I'm going to make bread. I mean, I'd always been a baker, but I hadn't done much bread. Right. So anyway, I started making sourdough, but also just editing, and it was the only thing that kept me sane. And but then during that time, that's when we also realized we could do our voiceover performance with Bruce Campbell and Ted Raimi and John Cryer. And because actors were sitting at home with nothing to do for 6 months. And so we're like, you know what, you guys all have Zoom. Some of you have decent microphones. And we basically did it over Zoom, and it was fun. It was in June of 2020. All of a sudden we could do this little self-contained 18.5-minute radio drama while everyone else was sitting around not doing anything creatively. So that was really fun to work on that with those guys. But also the same thing with musicians. Luis could reach out to musicians in Brazil and Mexico City. He had a buddy in Mexico who had been stuck and stranded in Mexico City. We're like, you know what? Put together a horn section. That's going to be our horn section. And they were like, all right, we got nothing else going on. Let's work on the movie. So musically, we started writing a lot more and a lot more songs and a lot more melodies and started filling it out with Caro, who played at Luis's studio in LA, but in an isolated booth. So that was safe. She had to go back to Brazil because of COVID reasons. And she worked with a studio in Brazil too. So we got them involved. Anyway, and then Daniel and I work on the script, and this goes back to the theme of the podcast is writing. Is that gave us a sort of unique luxury that you only kind of studio films do, where they take these breaks in editing, see what they have, and then they always do reshoots. Well, we didn't have to reshoot anything, but we had these 4 days, so we could kind of tweak the script and dial it in based on the footage we already had been editing, and that was really helpful. We got rid of a couple of scenes, we added 1 or 2 scenes, but it was and just like these little tweaks in the dialogue. Oh, we need a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. And that was really helpful. So when we got back to set and we had those 4 days, we could really kind of do exactly what we needed to and plug those scenes in.
I was really amazed when No Time to Die came out that this film had been sat on for 2 years, and and nobody thought, you know what, we could rewrite a bit of that villain character. He's not very good, is he? Can't we do a little bit more with him? Or does this plot point doesn't really make much sense, and that we should clarify that? I still don't know what the villain was actually planning to do with any of the stuff.
Yeah, it's bizarre. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Because I like the movie, but I've watched it once or twice more, and it makes less sense the more I watch it.
Yeah,
which should not happen in a movie.
Absolutely.
And you're right. They had time. They had time.
I mean, they could have ADR'd some, like, just a line saying, "Oh, well, you know, his plan is this," and that's it. You know, you've just got it in a nutshell. You know?
Well, who knows? Maybe they did do that, and you can imagine what it was before. So maybe it was even more confusing before. So maybe they did do some of that. I don't know, but
could be. Yeah. That's, well, you it looked like you did much more with that opportunity than they did. So it's a totally different film, but totally different genre. But
well, and then even after that, playing around with shooting a few insert shots in my garage where I am now. I actually have the tape player is here. Oh God, it's heavy. There's the tape player.
Well, I wanted to talk about that as well, because that's obviously central. But that technology, that sense of like, we need to go and get a tape machine, and we can't call Amazon because it doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
The idea of
and that was fun. Like, again, doing the research and figuring out like this was this kind of unique time before cassette tapes had really become mainstream, but 8-track was the hot new medium at that point, which didn't last very long, but that was the time where it was becoming the thing. So, and these reel-to-reel players, like, who had them, how many people had them, how accessible were they? Like, we looked into that quite a bit, and then it becomes a big plot point. Yeah,
because people keep talking about the garage. There's a guy at the garage who's like, they won't have a reel-to-reel player. What's that about? Or is it just like garages are like bodegas? They've got everything. So
yeah, maybe. Well, I think Leon at the gas station.
Yeah. Sorry, garage. That's my British English coming out. I mean, this is something I really think this is one of those sort of hidden delights of movies set in the 70s, is just the clunkiness of the thingness of things that that we don't really have anymore, because everything is sort of in the cloud and lightweight and all the rest of it.
And part of it was, we wanted to use that, as plot device, and also the fact that you couldn't just Google someone. When you were meeting someone new, you didn't know what they looked like, and you had to trust them or not trust them. And I think that's a big part of, why 70s conspiracy thrillers work, is because you didn't know what people look like, and were they telling the truth about who they were and when they were. And, so we kind of played around with those ideas a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, before I go to any place like a hotel or wherever, I'm go on Google Street View and have a look around and see, this place looks like a dump. I'm not going here. That's it. And what has the response been? Because you've been taking it theatrically around the States, and you've opened it in the UK as well.
Well, we started with the festival run starting last fall, kind of by design, somewhat by luck. We wound up playing 10 festivals in the fall that were kind of in that trough between Omicron and Delta. There was about a 2-month gap where, after a year of festivals all being virtual, there were finally live festivals, and you could show a film to a real audience and actually hear people laughing or crying or booing or whatever they were going to do. So we did about 10 festivals then. And then during that festival run is kind of when we started to get distribution for the film. because we didn't come into it with distribution. And so that was good. And then there was the Omicron spike over the winter. Festivals went remote again. And then we had this other gap where we played about another 10 or so festivals in the spring, kind of between Omicron and World War III, and where festivals were live. And that's when I went to the UK. We went to the Manchester Film Festival, and I won the Best Director prize and got COVID,
done.
So
damn.
Yeah, well, it came in the goodie bag,
Swings and roundabouts.
And then now with the theatrical run in the States, we're sort of in this other trough between, where monkeypox hasn't hit yet, but that'll be the next thing, and where people are starting to go to movie theaters. We opened the same weekend that Top Gun opened. So, but Tom Cruise got people in the theaters, and we took a couple of them into our theaters. But still, people are very, and with good reason, are still reluctant to go to theaters. And so, but that also changes everyone's expectations about what is a good performing film. Like if you can get 5 people on a weeknight, great, I'll take it. That's and that's fine. And then but we still had this like 45-day window before the VOD, kicked in, and that was, which again, a lot during the pandemic, certainly, and especially before the pandemic, most indie films were doing these day and date releases where the theatrical was the same as the VOD, but films would just get lost. And and I think by having that extra 45-day window and playing in 60 theaters, we were able to kind of make a little bit more of a splash for ourselves. And we timed it intentionally to come out around the same time as the 50th anniversary of the initial Watergate break-in, which was June 17th. And so there was a lot more press and attention and just consciousness about Watergate at the time, which certainly helped. And then, and then not for nothing, the January 6th committee hearings are going on, the Boris Johnson scandal's going on. So a lot of comparisons to Watergate these days, and that's only kind of helped us. And it's been fun, and it's been great to see the response that people have.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, the timing is so interesting as well, that you're kind of quite specifically sort of judging where to drop it, and then there's these accidental things happening which are just boosting it as well. Yeah. So it's been a lot of. I mean, I'm glad for your film. I wish it wasn't so prescient and so. Well, I mean, prescient. It's a period film, but it feels prescient. I mean, that's the problem.
Well, and that was, I always felt like, okay, with an independent film especially, but even with a Hollywood film, as we've discussed, you don't know exactly when people are going to see it. You can have a scheduled start, release date, and even that could get changed because of a global pandemic or whatever. So in doing, and it was interesting going back to the writing process, we tried not to do anything too specific to what was going on with the Trump administration over the course of those years, because we knew that would change. It would change the next day. It would change the next week. So, but I think thematically, we tried to put enough in there that anyone watching in the future, but also in any country, could relate to it, and it would be relevant and resonate with them in different ways at different times in different places. So like when we did show the film in Brazil at the Sao Paulo International Film Festival, that was our international premiere, everyone was like, oh, this is just like Bolsonaro.
Right,
and when we were in Manchester, people were like, oh, this is just like Boris Johnson. So that was, so that's been kind of fun and interesting to see sort of how it resonates with different people in different places.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, there is much more. You get the feeling that Nixon kind of lost the battle and won the war when it comes to sort of cultural influence compared to Kennedy, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. There's not many Kennedy-like politicians around at the moment, but there are plenty of Nixon-like politicians.
Exactly. Right.
But what next? Have you got something already cooking, or are you at that stage of sort of like post-coital smoking a cigarette?
Well, there's still a lot to do with this.
Right.
As much as I would love to be able to move on to the next thing right away, there's actually some talk about turning 18 and a half into a stage play. So I'm talking to some people at some theater companies about that. There's a little bit of chatter about maybe expanding it into an episodic series. It's mainly me doing that chattering, but it's someone is chattering, and that's what counts.
Come on, Netflix listen to this podcast, so
yeah, please. And you know, and also there's still a lot of like, I still have to cut all the behind the scenes stuff for the DVD and Blu-ray release, which is going to come out in the fall. The film's going to be coming out on airlines starting in September. And that's actually pretty cool and fairly unique, that we're going to come out on a number of different international airlines. There's a lot I need to do. And then there's just accounting and taxes that have to be done on every film that are very boring and very necessary, because otherwise the whole process falls apart. So there's a lot left, but I am starting to think about maybe what's next. But I think we're also going to be doing some college touring in the fall and the spring. And that'll be a lot of fun, because there's a lot of different ways that I think colleges could show the film as a midnight cult film, where every time Wonder Bread gets mentioned, people throw Wonder Bread at the screen. It could happen, you know, and you know, to academic, you know, screenings with history and political science departments, and touring around with that. So I'm looking forward to some of that too.
Yeah, I was wondering when as well, you know, when you're looking at this as a period film that has relevance to now, but I was kind of trying to think the other day about, you know, we haven't had our Donald Trump film yet. You know, I mean, George W. Bush, you know, Oliver Stone was making W, you know, pretty, you know, on the heels of the presidency itself. So, you know, I'm just wondering if that's what kind of cultural reaction is gonna come out of the political situation that we're living at the moment.
I mean, I'm sure people are already working on things. When they come out is another matter, because I think Stone came out with W, you know, pretty quickly, but it didn't do so well. You know, that's the thing, is I think you need some time to reflect on these things. Like all these people making pandemic films, like I don't want to watch a pandemic film now. I don't know that I'd want to watch a Trump film now. Like I just lived through it, you know? So I think you need some I think you need some time to kind of, you know, process it and reflect back on it. And then you can have fun with the creating the historical fiction sides of it, you know, because I think if you do something that's super specific and, you know, then if you get one little thing wrong, it throws everything. But I think if you do kind of our approach where you're creating these kind of side fictional characters, then it allows you a lot more creative freedom to do the thing.
I mean, I was thinking of that guy who's Will Ferrell's best mate, Adam McKay.
Adam McKay. Yeah, I'm sure. Right. Yeah, I'm sure he's working on something.
Yeah, he's got his crayon. He's got a box of crayons out, and he's writing his script.
Absolutely, and he's good at what he does, you know. But you know, when or not. But I think his Dick Cheney film, you know, again, that was good 8 years after Dick Cheney had already left. I think if he had done it any earlier, it wouldn't have made as much sense in a way. So you need a little bit of that time. But he's the kind of person, I'm sure someone's, you know, if he isn't working on a Trump script, I'm sure people are sending them.
Absolutely.
Whether he wants them or not.
This is in your wheelhouse, Adam. You got to work on it for your sins.
Exactly.
Dan, could you recommend a film book for us? As a listener to the podcast, you'll know that this question was coming up, I'm sure.
Well, funny you should say that, John. I just happen to have one here. Yeah. It's called The Cheerful Subversive's Guide to Independent Filmmaking, second edition, that I wrote. What are the odds?
This is the first. We've never had somebody recommend their own book on the podcast.
I know. What are the odds? This is the second edition of this thing. It's published by Focal Press, which is part of Routledge, which is kind of an academic publisher. So it has actually been used in film schools. And this edition I wrote while we were making the film. So there's actually a whole chapter on how to shoot a film in a global pandemic, which is all about how we made 18 and a half. I think the chapter name is COVID 18 and a half.
Right.
So I was writing it literally while we were shooting the movie. And so it's one of the few film books that actually goes into like the nuances of how do you direct wearing a mask and
right.
facial.
How do you direct wearing a
It's
mask?
complicated because normally you get accustomed to, you know, if you want to adjust an actor's performance or discuss with them between takes, you pull them aside, which you're not allowed to touch people now, you know, and whisper, which you can't do now. You have to, especially at the time, we had to stay 6 feet away. So you wind up saying, you know, yelling across the room for everybody to hear, you know, you're overacting, turn it down, or you know, do something to surprise the other actor. Oh, they can hear it. Or in the middle of a shot, you would whisper to the cinematographer or the camera operator, you know, like, you know, zoom in quietly. It's like, zoom in. You know, it's like, cut, you know, or the boom is in the shot. What? The boom is in the shot. What? The boom is in. So there's a lot of that kind of it, which is just, it just slows you down, and you really have to adjust how you relate to all these people in a way that is different than pre-pandemic. So it's things like that are, you know, and then, you know, where do you find, you know, SAG says you have to get PCR shots or testing, you know, 24-hour testing every 3 days. Well, if you're in a remote location and there's no labs out there, how do you deal with that? You know, right. And like, well, we found hospitals that we could work with directly, and that kind of helped a lot of other filmmakers. Once we found, you know, a methodology for that, you know, a lot of other people started doing that too. So yeah, it's not easy. It's not the preferred way. I mean, now with vaccinations, the DGA and SAG have come out with, you know, not relaxed, but slightly different rules where it makes it a little easier. But yeah, with those face shields, like, it was really freaky because someone would talk behind you and you would think they're in front of you because they would deflect the sound in weird ways. And I was always looking around like, who's talking to me? What's going on? It's not the ideal way to make a film, for sure. But
I was teaching with those masks on, and I was always feeling like somehow they couldn't see my mouth move. So how can I teach a language where, you know, students do look at your mouth and see if you're
exactly. It's a whole new world, but you know, people are figuring it out and making things and surviving and trying not to kill each other on set, you know. And
aside from the recommendations on COVID, that specific chapter, the book is a sort of a nuts and bolts how you make an independent film, and in terms of like what you were saying earlier about, you know, you got to pay your taxes, you got to, you know.
Yeah, it goes into all that stuff. Yeah, everything from finding a script, finding locations, to how to raise money, where to raise money, who to raise money from, how to set up an LLC or whatever structure you need, to casting, and how do you do casting, and when do you do casting, and you know, and then post-production. Film festivals is a whole section on film festivals and what you do with your career, you know, when you're all done. And I think kind of the underlying theme of the book kind of goes back to something Robert Altman kind of instilled in me and Dana, which was, you know, tell everyone the train's leaving the station, you set a start date, and you stick to that date. And if you haven't, you know, you could keep pushing this project for years and years and years and never make the film. And that is certainly true with 18½. If we had pushed it because, we heard rumblings of a pandemic, we might still never have made the movie, you know, to this day. And but that, you know, once you kind of get that philosophy in mind, like, I'm going to make this film, like, I may wind up shooting it on an iPhone or IMAX and anything in between. But we're going to make the movie, and we're going to make it on such and such a day. Then it sort of helps inform how you're going to raise money, how much money you're going to raise, how you're going to cast it. You know, because I do a lot of crowdfunding, and that's cast agnostic financing. So you don't know who your cast is going to be. As I say, even once you start shooting a movie, you still don't know always. But at least we're making the movie, you know. And so that's kind of the underlying, you know, theme of the book. And is, you know, it's better to make the low budget movie than to not make the big budget version, which you could wait around for years to make. So and that's kind of been my career, like just make them and see who you wind up getting, and hope for the best.
I always think that the writing has to sort of that's your first frontier, if you like, in terms of the you get, that's the bit that you don't have to pay anybody in terms of, well, of course you have to pay the writer but if you are the writer, you can, no, you don't pay anybody. But do you know what I mean? It's just it's sort of somebody said to me recently that a plot twist is the cheapest special effect. And I thought that's such a... I was someone on this podcast, so you can go back and find out who it was. Was it Tom Schoen, maybe? Anyway, the whole idea being that that's one thing, like as a low budget, you don't have to spend loads of money on it. But if you have a really good story, a really good... As you did with the MacGuffin, it's such a great concept, and that didn't cost you a penny. That was just exactly in the script.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. What I've found is the thing that's the biggest unknown in budgeting and planning a thing is location. Because my experience is locations are either free or they're surprisingly expensive, and you don't always know what they're going to be until you start getting into it. So which is why if you start with someone saying, hey, here's this motel and we'll give it to you more or less for free, like you write the script around that. That's the kind of a good, I've done that on a couple films, but that's the biggest unknown, because casting and crew, like you can, like, okay, if we're shooting it on an iPhone, this is what we're going to pay the crew. If we're shooting on 35 millimeter, this is what we're going to pay. If we're shooting it on an Alexa, this is kind of the scale and the scope of it. But like you said, if it's not in the script, it's not going to be in the movie, and the writing, it costs a couple cups of coffee, per scene in the movie, and that's it.
Only per scene, or I would 4 or 5 per scene, I'd say.
Yeah, at least, yeah.
Brilliant, Dan. Well, I'm going to get a copy of that book because it's my ambition. I shall state it boldly here. In the next couple of years, I'm going to make a film.
All right, that's
yeah. I've just realised that nothing I do ever gets done unless I do it myself. Do you know what I mean? It's like
absolutely
this podcast.
Yeah.
If I sort of pitched this to somebody else, I'd still not be doing it. But if I just do it on my own, then here it goes. So
yeah, exactly. Well, the book you can get it around the world. In fact, the first edition just got translated into Chinese. So if you read Mandarin, you can get that. But I also did the
Callie only speak Cantonese. Damn it.
Next edition. But yeah, I did an audio version of the book this past year as well. So that's available out there as well. But yeah, no, I mean, that's the secret. You just have to do it yourself. I mean, I live a block and a half south of the Sony lot, one of the biggest studios in Hollywood. It used to be the MGM lot. And I have to remind myself, they're not knocking on my door at all. But technically, since I'm south of them, they're in my shadow, not the other way around. So that's the only way I can wake up in the morning.
You console yourself with that thought. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dan. Congratulations on the film, and everyone should go and see it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for everything.
Okay, I'm gonna cut there. But yeah, that was a brilliant conversation. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, nice chatting with you.
So that was me and Dan talking about his film 18 and a Half and his career generally, and it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. We really got down into some stuff there, and a very varied conversation as well. Hopefully it will inspire you to go and watch 18 and a Half, or maybe you've already seen it. I mean, and that's even better. Over the next couple of weeks, it's going to be festival time, so hopefully I should get another episode out for next week, but just be aware that it might be a bit of a bumpy road as we go into as we leave the summer and head towards the autumn. Yeah, nothing else really to say except thank you, Ali Harwood, for the design and the artwork. Thank you very much to Elliot Atkins for the music, and thank you, dear listener, for for keeping me company while I do this. And of course, thank you to my guest, Dan Mirvish. His movie, again, 18½, to be watched and enjoyed. So, until next time, take care.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.